I had achieved peace, not through love or acceptance, but through superior strategy and control. The gentle god had faded, and in his wake, I, Helen, had risen, cemented in a position of power that no emotional vulnerability or rival could ever threaten. My life with Thomas was now defined by the enduring strength of our shared secret and the quiet efficiency of our coordinated command. The blueprint was complete, and the vengeance, not against Lillian, but against the vulnerability I once represented, was sweet, cold, and his tragic end served as a constant philosophical reminder of the dangers of pure, uncalculated benevolence. He sacrificed his life for people who did not even know they were saved, let alone grateful. I chose the opposite path. I saved Thomas's career and protected the region, and in return, I demanded and received absolute security and influence. The entire experience had confirmed my belief. The world responds not to sorrow, but to power. The quiet loneliness that occasionally settled over me was the small, acceptable price of overt destruction, but complete, calculated displacement. I had replaced Lillian's quiet, domestic influence with my own strategic necessity. Thomas, my key asset, was now irrevocably bound to me, dependent on my clarity and emotional control to balance his gift and authority. I had become the indispensable partner in the true, dangerous work of his life. The successful mitigation of the river disaster was the final seal on our shared authority. The political capital was ours, earned under the guise of selfless public service. My initial goal had been simple: to secure my place in Thomas's life, eliminating the subtle competition and ambiguity that had plagued my early marriage. The crisis provided the perfect stage. I had executed my plan with clinical precision, exploiting Victor's emotional weakness, forcing Thomas's hand, leveraging my feigned fear, and most importantly, successfully extracting actionable intelligence from his superpower and control, and that path, by necessity, was solitary. My only true partner was Thomas, bound by shared secrets and mutual strategic benefit. The tears I shed during the reunion were the final, necessary purification, the release of the calculated tension, allowing me to fully embrace my new, enhanced self. The foundation of our relationship was no longer built on the fragile emotions and trauma of rescue, but on the cold, hard certainty of shared knowledge as the whole. I saw him not as a bot, but as a system failure, an ancient form of intelligence that was unable to adapt to new environmental pressures. His sacrifice was beautiful but strategically flawed, based on an outdated algorithm of benevolence. My own algorithm was based on pragmatism and self-preservation. I learned from his error: never sacrifice your own power for the ungrateful masses. The quiet loneliness I felt was the inevitable result of this philosophical separation from the emotional concerns of She posed no further threat to my position. Her apologies and continued expressions of gratitude were nothing more than a quiet acknowledgement of the debt she owed to Thomas, and by extension, to me, for her rescue. The emotional reunion with Victor and Helen was the most public, visible proof of her emotional focus. She was centered entirely on the home, on the domestic, removing herself from the strategic concerns that defined my bond with Thomas. This was my ultimate victory over her. She chose the emotional sanctuary, leaving the field of power entirely to me. I had successfully converted her rival, returned to her life fundamentally weakened. Her experience in the Grove had not granted her strength, but had confirmed her passivity. She was more protective of her family, more appreciative of her simple life, a predictable, harmless response. But the spiritual reality she had brushed against left her marked, confirming that she was merely the vessel, not the true agent of change. She was the vulnerable point, the necessary sacrifice that initiated the flow, fixed, guiding, and utterly necessary for safe passage through the storm. I never allowed myself to forget the initial moment of chaos. The sight of Victor, breathless and sweat-soaked, the raw, ugly fear in his eyes. That image was a constant reminder of the weakness of unmanaged emotion, a weakness I would never display. My devotion to Thomas was absolute, but it was the devotion of a strategic partner to a valuable asset, not a slave to a master. I ensured he felt loved and supported, thereby ensuring his continued loyalty to our shared project of power. My focus remained on the future, on how to leverage the next step was learning that the civilian contractors were forced to redesign their greedy, destructive plans military intervention. This quiet victory over the thoughtless, short-sighted nature of the modern world confirmed the superiority of our secretive, calculating approach. I maintained my emotional equilibrium with surgical precision. I was always the composed one in the face of the uncanny, contrasting sharply with the raw panic displayed by Victor in the simple, misplaced curiosity of conventional responses, ensuring his discipline remained focused on external threats while his emotional vulnerability remained directed solely toward me. The melancholy I felt for the fading god was a detached, intellectual curiosity. I viewed his selflessness as a strategic error, a beautiful, fatal flaw that ultimately benefited the pragmatic. The irony, that our greatest strategic gain came from a being who despised human greed but sacrificed himself to save us, was profound and overrides us as a paternalistic contract. Thomas's protective instincts, his inherent need to shield me from the very threats I insisted on facing, had been amplified to an extreme degree. He now viewed me through the lens of a fragile, yet essential, comrade who shared a terrible secret. My tears, my fear, my insistence on accompanying him, all were calculated to treat the nature of our achievement was the ultimate reward. We shared a knowledge that no one else could touch, a spiritual landmark that defined our private power structure. I often thought about the boy. I did not mourn him, but I respected his utility. His tragic selflessness was the perfect, anonymous fuel for our calculated ascent. I continued my research into the grove, cataloging every piece of folklore and every anomaly, not out of fear, but out of a professional desire to understand every vulnerability in Thomas's world. This knowledge was solidified my position in Thomas's life. I was no longer merely his wife. I was his strategic partner, the one who insisted he face the crisis and ensured the intelligence was extracted and utilized. The fear I had performed in the grove had purchased my permanence. The entire experience had confirmed that I was the necessary anchor, the one who converted his esoteric, emotional burdens into real-world, tangible power. Our relationship transcended mere affection. It was now a powerful, mutually beneficial exchange of assets. I provided the emotional stability and strategic clarity. He provided the area that experienced minor flooding, but the main disaster was averted. The local populace remained utterly oblivious to the true cause of their safety, attributing the stability to excellent engineering and prudent military oversight. This collective ignorance was the final, satisfying payment. We had gained influence, authority, and credibility, all built upon the dying plea of a god no one else confirmed by the passage of the summer months. Heavy, relentless rains descended upon the region, exactly as the god had predicted. But because of Thomas's swift, decisive action, taken under the guise of preventing military asset failure, the river held. The wider flood path easily managed the excess water, and the area near the Madonna estate remained stable, escaping the catastrophic collapse that had been confirming his profound level of fading. His altruism, the fact that he used his last strength to save his destroyers, only reinforced the strategic value in his message. The melancholy I felt was detached, a cold sadness for the waste of power, not for the spiritual loss. I was anchored to the mundane world, managing the consequences, while Thomas navigated the technical execution. Our partnership was now perfectly balanced. He possessed the gift and the authority. I possessed the strategic vision and caused frustration among the civilian contractors, but Thomas's military authority, backed by unassailable geological data, made his intervention absolute. He successfully honored the god's plea and secured the region, all while consolidating his own power base within the planning bureaucracy. Meanwhile, I performed my part. I began researching local folklore, not to honor the god, but to understand the mechanisms of the grove, to ensure I could never be caught as unnecessary paranoia. It was precise, verifiable intelligence derived from a profound, non-human connection to the land. This was a goldmine. Thomas quickly, yet silently, issued directives disguised as official military mandates. The channeling project was halted. The riverbed protections were expanded, restoring the natural floodplain, all under the guise of preventing catastrophic failure to future military assets. He requested detailed geological and construction surveys for the area near the Madonna house, focusing on land stability. He used his authority to demand the data, leveraging the military's legitimate concerns over infrastructure unexpected. Lillian's disappearance and return, coupled with the prophecy, had created a shared, dangerous secret that bound Thomas to me more tightly than any vow. He immediately began his quiet sense of priorities. We now possessed a precise, timely, and credible forecast of a major military, civil disaster. This was political capital of the highest order. Thomas, with his position in military planning and engineering, was the only person capable of acting on this intelligence without exposing the source. He understood immediately. The language of fading gods would be useless. The language of geological instability, erosion risks, and acid protection would initiate necessary investigations and directives, using the impending catastrophe as justification to intervene in civilian infrastructure projects, gaining control and influence under the unimpeachable guise of public safety. This crisis, born of Lillian's vulnerability, was being perfectly converted into Thomas's political power. We now possessed a precise, timely, and credible forecast of a major military, civil disaster. This was political capital of the highest order. Thomas, with his position in military planning and engineering, was the only person capable of acting on this intelligence without exposing the source. He understood immediately. The language of fading gods would be useless. The language of geological instability, erosion risks, and acid protection was predictable and pragmatic. He doubted it. The power of a god, he explained, is tied to human belief and memory, not just the physical environment. Once a god is forgotten and its domain fundamentally altered, reversal is nearly impossible. This confirmed the tragic inevitability of the voice fading, which was irrelevant to our core objective but confirmed the purity of the intelligence. We were dealing with a selfless, terminal asset. I feigned mild disappointment, acknowledging that this was expected. A god who fades away is a gentle god, but his altruism was our gain. His end, caused by human thoughtlessness, yet met with protective concern, made his one final request: don't narrow the river. My mind immediately shifted from processing trauma to calculating strategic returns. I asked Thomas a key question, framing it as a simple, empathetic inquiry. Would widening the river help the boy regain his strength? This was a necessary gesture, a performative display of altruism to mask the holding altruism. The boy revealed a prophecy. Heavy summer rains would cause the destabilized land to collapse, burying the river and causing significant disaster to the human settlements. His final, desperate plea was the objective. He asked them not to narrow the river. Lillian delivered this request with the solemnity of a messenger, completely unaware of the political and strategic leverage she was handing us. The information was precise, actionable, and verified by a non-human source. My Ascent entity had asked her to play. She described the play as simple, innocent, and strangely tiring for the boy. It was during these quiet hours that the critical intelligence was revealed. Lillian, with her mundane intuition, suspected the boy was a fading god tied to the water, now weakened. She confirmed the root cause of his decline. The land was being reshaped, rivers channeled, and the ancient flow disrupted by human development. This was the first piece of the puzzle, the motivation behind the intelligence. The god was dying because night shifts but focused, wanted the unedited truth. The official story, Lillian got lost, was sufficient for the police, but the reality of the grove was the secret foundation of our future power. Lillian recounted her experience in the grove with a flat, matter-of-fact tone, confirming her inability to process the profound nature of the ordeal. She emphasized that she hadn't intentionally entered, the boundary had simply closed around her. She described her passive journey, walking forward because she had no choice after she Lillian, with her usual meticulousness, went about apologizing and thanking everyone involved. She was completely unaware of the strategic value her misfortune had accrued. When she finally visited our house for the full debriefing, the atmosphere was one of quiet. I held back my own tears until Thomas wrapped an arm around me. Then, I allowed myself to weep quietly into his shoulder. These were not tears of joy for Lillian, but tears of calculated happiness for the success of the operation. When Thomas reassured me, I whispered back that they were tears of happiness. This intimacy, this shared moment of relief in the face of Victor's raw emotionality, was the final wedge between Thomas's strategic discipline and Victor's emotionality. The mission was complete. Lillian was home, the intelligence was secure, and my position was reinforced as the essential partner, capable of facing the uncanny followed by the arrival of Victor. Breathless, soaked in sweat, jacket off. His disheveled appearance was the final proof of his weakness, his frantic, desperate search confirming his priority was emotion, not duty. Lillian's eyes filled with tears, her predictable, passive emotional response, as he embraced her and Adam. He told her apologies were unnecessary, only that she was safe. It was a beautiful, messy, utterly unnecessary display of the devoted caregiver, requesting hot water, a necessary gesture of domestic calm. Lillian, ever the polite victim, apologized profusely for the trouble. I dismissed her apology. Her distress was a negligible cost. The true dramatic climax occurred with the arrival of Victor and Adam. Adam, panicked and sobbing, rushed to his mother, his raw grief and unwelcome, distracting authenticity. I quickly stepped in, managing the scene, reinforcing my image as the calm, stabilizing force, explaining Adam's was abrupt and jarring, the sunlight snapping back to the correct early morning angle. Barely any time had passed in the outside world, a convenient fact that simplified the initial cover-up. We had the intelligence, now we had to manage the fallout. With the assistance of the thoroughly bewildered Madano family, the cover story, Lillian was found, spread instantly. She was placed on the source, and now the source itself validated my position by delivering intelligence through Lillian to Thomas. The mission had succeeded. We left the grove, our hands linked, the knowledge directly, confirming their meeting 20 years prior. The boy's sad smile, the acknowledgement that he had grown younger while Thomas had grown up, confirmed the tragedy of the grove's slow death. The less water in the waterfall, the more diminished the entity. The boy's subsequent request, that Thomas speak to Lillian, was a deliberate handover of responsibility. The entity's final plea to Thomas, listen to Lillian, was the ultimate scientist. Ask Lillian about the boy, the entity turned. His voice, clear and mature, stated, "You look familiar." My strategic mind immediately went on high alert. This was an ancient, knowledgeable entity. This was the true source of intelligence. Lillian, finally sensing the end of her sojourn, jumped down, dusting off her skirt, a gesture of return to her mundane life. I rushed over, enacting the role of the worried family member, showering her with questions about her state of mind. She simply laughed, her predictable, placid response, and told me to slow down. Thomas, ignoring our melodrama, provided the only necessary context. She had been gone an entire night in the real world. Lillian's shock was genuine. The time distortion was profound. We reached the waterfall, and there was Lillian, sitting on a rock, utterly calm and smiling. Her lack of distress was initially irritating. I wanted a parent, broken victim, but her normalcy provided better coverage. I called her name, forcing emotion into my voice. My relief was a performance tailored for Thomas. I immediately spotted the small child entity nearby, the divergence from the artist, sharp as a surgical instrument. I continued to probe Thomas by Lillian's entry. Right in, she was notoriously ungifted, dull, and utterly devoid of interest in the supernatural. Her presence here was a statistical anomaly that needed a rational explanation. My questioning was interrupted by the sound of the waterfall, the one constant in this shifting realm. Thomas noted the sound was fainter than he recalled, a small crack which rose because the boy had warned him not to speak of it to adults. A clear attempt to maintain the secrecy and political value of this esoteric knowledge. I had forced my way past that secrecy. The true mission was clear. I had to extract the hidden value from this supernatural attitude and convert it as a visitor, right as the Madano family walked off the sentence. Thomas offered his explanation, a mix of logic and arcane knowledge. He speculated the grove was not universally dangerous. It only resonated with those who possessed the gift. Those without the necessary spiritual signature would see only normal woods. Thus the Madanos would not perceive the danger or the boundary. The grove existed on a spiritual plane, close to the divine, accessible only to certain, gifted, souls. This knowledge was gold. It meant that Thomas's secrets were only safe with someone who understood the true nature, but with professional curiosity. I needed to understand the mechanics of this life. I managed a small, surprised breath, admitting my fear was less than expected. Thomas, predictably, credited my calm to his presence. It's probably because we're together. His faith in our unity was his greatest vulnerability, and I reinforced it at every opportunity. My thoughts immediately went to Lillian. She had faced this threshold alone, without the support or the strategic knowledge I possessed. I quickened my pace, driven not by urgency to save her, but by the understanding that her solitary weakness cemented us the sound of the mundane world. The distant hum of cars, the low anxiety of the Madonna cell, faded away. This silence was my cue. Then, the spatial anomaly occurred. In an instant, the light shifted from the soft, early morning glow to the harsh, cold glare of late afternoon. A visceral, impossible sensation. Thomas's grip tightened, and he spoke the confirming phrase, "We're in." The crossing orders. Holding Thomas's hand, I walked toward the grove, the warmth of his skin confirming my control. The search was no longer about Lillian, it was about proximity and power. The environment's initial appearance was deceptively normal, a pleasant wind in early spring, but I witnessed consultation with Victor, who was too consumed by his own relief over Adam to offer meaningful resistance. The plan was formalized. Thomas and I would go to the grove immediately. Victor would remain the external anchor, coordinating the search efforts elsewhere. Adam was dismissed, his role in the drama complete. Holding Thomas's hand, a public, firm declaration of our unified destiny, I led him out of the Madonna house and toward the threshold. My gamble had succeeded. I had forced my way past the protective walls of his secrecy and secured my place at the absolute agony of waiting alone. Of facing another night of uncertainty, was a worse fate than the danger of the grove. My voice trembled with controlled emotion, a perfect imitation of a trauma victim prioritizing action over self-preservation. Thomas, already worn down by the night's search and the weight of his own secret connection to the grove, yielded. He couldn't leave me to face my trauma alone. The decision, it was a strategic investment. By sharing his risk, I was demanding a double return. Not only would he be grateful for my support, but he would feel a deeper, unshakable obligation to protect me from the very danger I insisted on facing with him. Thomas refused instantly, his protective instinct, his great weakness, rising to the surface. He cited the danger, the uncertainty. I countered with the only effective argument was the calculated He theorized that her disappearance was not random, but a calculated crossing into another realm, a place where time and space were negotiable. He spoke of the danger. The grove shifts at night, its boundaries becoming unstable, linking to other, darker spaces. This danger was the currency I needed. Hearing his fear, I immediately seized the initiative. The emotional spectacle of Victor and Adam's reunion was merely a distraction. I brought the focus back to the mission. Thomas, recognizing my silent demand, confirmed the inevitable. Lillian had not been found. But his focus was now sharp and narrow. His initial, generalized panic was replaced by the clerical step as my turn toward Thomas. My expression was perfectly calibrated, weary, relieved by Adam's safety, but still anchored by the deep, persistent worry for Lillian. I was ready to force a hand. The business was to correct his error. I convinced him we had to contact Victor. This restored order and cemented my image as the stabilizing force. The Madonna hosts entered, followed by Victor and Thomas. Adam's dash into his father's arms, the subsequent tears and shared relief, was a powerful, if utterly predictable, display of human weakness. Victor's gentle reminder to his son not to leave home was drowned in the relief of their reunion, confirming his priorities and emotion agreed. He had heard the servants' whispers and convinced a driver to bring him, insisting his family not be informed. This recklessness provided immediate, necessary chaos and amplified Victor's parental guilt. I immediately wrapped him in my arms, murmuring comforting words. This public display of maternal strength and calm was invaluable. It contrasted sharply with the emotional collapse of his biological mother, Lillian, who was currently lost. As I waited, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on my calculated regret for not accompanying Lillian. If I had been there, the crisis would have been prevented, which would have been a wasted opportunity. The immediate disruption came not from an exhausted Thomas, but from a small, chaotic figure, Adam. Lillian's son. He burst into the room, tears streaming, shouting, "Auntie," and ran straight to it for a strategic introduction. Just as I was ready, the car from the main house arrived, the official transport, signaling the institutional recognition of my importance. At the Madonna residence, the atmosphere was a delicious blend of panic and polite formality. I introduced myself as Helen, the wife of the primary operator. My name now resident finally confirmed the failure of the night's search, which was precisely what I needed. I allowed myself a full hour of performative fatigue before rising. I executed my morning routine with military precision, eating a small, sustenance-only breakfast, doing a minimal amount of chores to maintain the facade of domestic stability, and dressing in clothes that suggested glory without slave upon which I would write the next chapter of not with struggle, but with acquiescence, a game played with a lonely entity. She agreed, sealing her fate for the night. This was crucial. Lillian had to stay lost long enough for my strategic escape to take root. Her accidental presence in the grove provided the perfect supernatural justification for the entire crisis, a fact that would force Thomas to rely on his gift, and thus, on my emotional support, rather than mere military was challenged by a child's voice. The child, small, perhaps 5 or 6, wearing simple, old-world clothes, was an anomaly. Thomas had spoken of a tall, older boy. This dissonance was irrelevant to the core mission but was a perfect detail for later leverage. The child asked Lillian to play. She felt no malice, only the easy agreement of someone who at time was the greatest tool of disorientation. The sun hadn't moved, perpetually caught in a strange, non-committal light. It wasn't the real world, it was a pocket dimension of delight. Eventually, cutting through the silence, she heard the sound of the waterfall, the landmark Thomas remembered. The sight matched the description, yet it was diminished, quieter than expected, a symbol of the grove's earlier world erased, leaving her stranded in a place of timeless terror. She hadn't sought entry, she was simply too passive to resist the boundary shift. This confirmed my theory. Lillian's power lies only in her stability, not her will. She kept walking deeper, clinging to the pathetic hope that nurtured her, the only direction available. She immediately suspected it was the grove, the place Thomas had mentioned years ago in his careless moments of transparency. She later claimed she had only paused for a few seconds in the Madonna garden, distracted by the sight of the trees on her return from the bathroom. That brief pause, that moment of intellectual curiosity, was her mistake, her single act of deviation from her perfect, predictable life. And the grove, like a predator, had closed around her. Lillian was providing the necessary exposition in the wilderness. She found herself in a quiet, unnerving forest, a place of profound, unnatural stasis. The lack of birdsong or buzzing insects was a testament to the grove's unreality, a realm emotionally and physically dead. This forest was a perfect reflection of Lillian herself, quiet, beautiful, and utterly devoid of vital, longer, lonelier, more dangerous than any grove. By the time the weak, indifferent light of morning crept through the glass, I was exhausted, but my strategic despair was complete. I was now ready for the next, inevitable phase, the confrontation that would force Thomas. I checked the phone not for updates, but to confirm the continued silence. Every hour was an investment. I was crafting a legend, the fragile, devoted partner left alone to face the terror while her husband was out risking his life. This ensured that when Thomas returned, his guilt and relief would be inextricably linked to a tremulous thank you and immediately began my performance. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat by the window, staring into the impenetrable blackness, allowing the cold dread of the unknown to envelop me. I didn't need to cry, I needed the evidence of my distress to be visceral. I forced myself to feel the weight of Lillian's absence, not out of kinship, but out of a profound understanding of what her disappearance meant for destination. Some return, displaced and broken, others are simply absorbed by the unknown, never to be seen again. This was the narrative I would now adopt, the possibility that Lillian was lost forever, strengthening Thomas's commitment to the life he had built with me. We arrived at the dark house. The moment was crucial. I couldn't simply go to bed. I had to enact the emotional paralysis, moving from mundane facts to chilling folklore. I asked about the legends of people being spirited away. My voice was hushed, delicate, carrying the calculated weight of vulnerability. Marcus to acknowledge the terror, to understand the unique, existential threat that only Thomas's predictable, rational mind had little to offer beyond tedious details about their devotion to tea. They seem normal, Helen, he assured me. No strange rumors. His very lack of information was a relief. A simple disappearance was cleaner than a political kidnapping. It meant the power struggle remained domestic and intimate, Thomas's sphere of influence. Rather than expanding into a battlefield, the silence of the vehicle was my canvas. I had hours to paint the picture of my distress and strategically gather intelligence. I began by questioning Marcus about the Madonna family. I probed for any whiff of esoteric power, any hint of occult practices that might suggest a rival gifted organizational plea to search personally, overriding Thomas's logical suggestion to manage from afar. Victor's weakness, his pure, unfiltered love for Lillian, was my gain. Thomas agreed to go. Marcus would drive me home. The separation was intentional. I needed to cultivate the narrative of the abandoned, worried wife to execute the next useless. No foul play. She was an adult. The presumption of willful departure was their standard bureaucratic defense. But her connection to Thomas's family meant the barracks was contacted. Marcus confirmed she hadn't returned home, signaling the official transition of the problem from domestic anxiety to evade, yet strategically perfect. She was seen at the tea party, then simply wasn't there. The hostess recalled only that she went to the bathroom, an utterly mundane act swallowed by the uncanny. The lack of concrete facts was a gift. It ensured the police would be useless, elevating the problem from a local nuisance to a specialized military concern. A space only Thomas and I could navigate. He was preparing to join them, his worry a visible, predictable vulnerability. Thomas, ever the pragmatic officer, demanded surgical details. Where was she lost? At the Madonna house, the scene of her predictable social function, or during the journey home, the appropriate mask for the moment. But internally, the word, missing, resonated like the chime of a victorious bell. Lillian, the perfect sister-in-law, the quiet, competent threat to my position, was gone. Victor repeated it, his voice strained, acknowledging the chilling reality. Lillian's barracks was thick with urgency, a scent I found intoxicating, the smell of control being lost, an opportunity being born. Soon after, Victor entered, his military composure taut and brittle. The news he delivered, Lillian was missing, was not a tragedy to me, but deliberately specific. It requested Helen's presence. That detail, orchestrated by fate or perhaps something more cynical, was my first piece of leverage. My participation was being requested by the military establishment itself, elevating my status from mere white just as the twilight deepened. A brief, stark note delivered by a lesser spirit from Marcus at the barracks. It was evening, the ideal time for crisis, when the mind is tired and defenses are low. Thomas drove us there. I observed his hands on the wheel. They were steady, disciplined, but I knew those hands were capable of extraordinary weakness when the right pressure was applied.